Peace and blessings be upon you. Juma Mubarak. Today we're going to be discussing the concept of imamate, deconstructing it and reconstructing it. One of the primary things that distinguishes Islam from some of the key verses in the Quran versus earlier Abrahamic traditions is an attempt to de-emphasize ecclesial hierarchy. So for those who are not familiar with the jargon, ecclesiology is the study of how we understand God's relationship to us through human intermediaries in a hierarchy. And so that there are a series of intermediaries that forms a sort of ecclesial governance, a governance of divine mediation through humans, possibly also angels, and humans of very high rank of saints and prophets and so on. And so in Christianity, ecclesiology is a particularly pointed issue because you have very storied history with the Orthodox Church splitting from the Catholic Church, the appointment of the idea of papacy about 1,000 years ago versus bishops and synods, which was a more clustered regional consensus in Orthodoxy. And then when we arrive at the Protestant Reformation, the primary focus of that Reformation was to redefine the ecclesiology. And so we see the first wave of Christian Reformation churches, the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Anglicans, that they are keeping an ecclesial hierarchy, but they're taking the privilege of remolding it along their own group rather than what the Catholics would call a apostolic succession, that the guy who touched me in a magical way was touched in a this is completely not euphemistic, this is completely playing this straight, was touched, was his hands were laid on his shoulders. Let's be specific. We've all had our imaginations perverted by scandal and an abundance of information about corruption. So I've been instilled with a spirit that was instilled with a spirit, and so on, going back to the Rasulullah, going back ultimately to God. So there's something special about me. I've been ordained. I'm clerical. I'm not just somebody who knows things. I'm somebody with a special energy, and I'm capable of doing what you might call white magic if you were theosophical about Christianity. And in Judaism, there's a similar concept with the priesthood of the Levite tribe, of the descendants of Aaron or Harun in the Quran, alayhi salam. And that the rabbinical tradition that is codified in the Talmud is in some sense endowed not just with a hearsay claim that these are things that were transmitted from Moses, but also that the people who are recording this and keeping this tradition are themselves special. And these both are criticized in the Quran as being a tagut, that they are making lords out of these humans, and that this is very naughty. This is something where your service to God through these people will not be accepted. And there's a more serious interpretation of that where it nullifies everything else that you've done, even if you have done good things in a pure intention, which we'll get to for reasons we'll get to is very problematic for anybody's or the vast majority's salvation, even those who are indeed religious. So let's take the more charitable interpretation that you're not getting points with God for doing all of these extra things that are innovated by humans and without divine sanction. So when it comes to interpreting the Quran in the Quranist movement and its adjuncts, which this is sort of in the loose wing of that formation, the same way that the birds do salah together. And we are in this digital Jamaat over many nations in this time of Qiyamah, this time of revelation, where information is widely accessible. And this movement is very much rooted in something that is pretty clearly rooted in the origins of the Quran and Islam and the movement of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, which is that those who are the people of knowledge, those who are in authority among you, this is a verse, follow Allah, the Rasul, and those in authority. The Shia take this to mean the Imams, their specific lineage, whichever lineage they subscribe to. They specifically cite that verse. And the Sunnis will take that verse and also refer to those knowledge among you as a sanction to listen to Ahmad ibn Hanbal or whomever they subscribe to. And we have this idea, which is intention, of the clerical job being desacralized and perhaps distributed, and such that anyone who is knowledgeable can qualify. And so you'll see this with people working at an investment bank, let's say in Dubai. It's a halal investment bank. These might be wealthy men. There's a sheikh among them. He comes to them for a board meeting, and now it's we've had lunch, we have our meeting, we've had lunch. Now it's time for duhur, and the janitor is known as a man of great iman and tremendous taqwa. So in the Quran, it says that it is not about race or wealth or any status other than the righteous or the piety of the individual. This is foremost in the sight of Allah. And so, being good Muslims who are observant of this concept, this janitor will stand in front of everyone and lead the prayer. And that's a beautiful thing. This is really one of the most beautiful things about Islam is this egalitarian meritocracy of taqwa. And so there was this understanding in the time of, for instance, Abu Hanifa, that you could be anyone who is knowledgeable, who has put in the time to study, and people will respect you for that knowledge. And especially in an era of rampant illiteracy, where just being able to read the Quran, much less a hadith collection, is 1 out of 20 people would have that ability. And so thus 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 200 would be fairly knowledgeable, having invested that skill in not just core religious knowledge, the fard readings of the Quran and so on, being able to recite more than a few things, having read and pondered more than just Surah Kaf and Surah Yusuf, and some of the short surahs, obviously like Ikhlas or Al-Nas, but that you can really talk about the Quran and you can thus write down fiqh and you can write books. This was a tremendously valuable and rare skill at this time. And there's the famous interaction with Abu Hanifa and Jafar. And Jafar is a great grandson, no, a great great grandson of the Prophet. And he is somehow, he believes himself, and Shia believe him. Ismaili, Twelver, Zaidi, all of them, they all recognize Jafar. Well, maybe not the Zaydis. The Zaydis stop with Zayd, who was a, I think, brother of Jafar's. Who's the Jafar's uncle. So they're not necessarily on the Jafari madhab, on Jafari fiqh. And I don't. I've been in the dunya trying to accomplish things to make money, so I'm not so freshly read, so I can't quote it verbatim. But the interaction goes along the lines of um, Jafar asks him, for example, what what najas is more foul, and Abu Hanifa says, well, feces is the most foul najas. And Jafar says, yes, but if you get some on your hands, you can just wash your hands. But if you are emitting the sexual najas, you must take a ghusl. Why is that? And Abu Hanifa's like, beats me, brother. It beats me, bro. And there's another couple of points to this effect about some of these details of fiqh, and how there's a certain degree of arbitrariness, or not arbitrariness, but there's knowledge, there's a mystical knowledge that underlies these things that is not apparent to reason. And thus he sort of chastises Abu Hanifa for his entire usuli approach, which is more or less what the fiqh of the Mutazili would have been, and what the general approach of Quran centric and Quranist and modernist Muslims in these last couple of centuries would be, to reconstructing fiqh outside of those madhabs. Or if you want to be like an early Hanafi or an early Maliki. Early Maliki is a little more grounded in the specific traditions of the people of Medina. And so there's this invested concept of mystical uniqueness and unexplained insight in the presumably accurate sayings reported, which aren't that many. There are many things that are just simply ethnographic in the Muwatta of Malik, that this is what my grandfather did, who was a Sahabi, and that's good enough. And so there's a certain humility to that hadith collection. It's really a hadith collection, an ethnography, and a book of fiqh rolled into one, which is why it's something I that anchored me away from this dialectic of, hadiths are shirk, or if you don't follow every hadith in Bukhari, then you're a kafir. And how do I not be a mushrik or a kafir? What's the middle path? Well, here's a little bit of historically rooted science. And then there are, of course, things that I criticized about the Muwatta, most notably the treatment of women. Um, but then I can say, well, that was not, that's not the best thing in God's eyes, to my understanding. But it's how they practiced Islam and how they lived in Medina. And I can accept that context as being a historical data point. And Abu Hanifa, who's a bit older, was operating in a somewhat more cosmopolitan trading modality in southern Iraq, and a bit more worldly and a bit more grounded in first principles, because he didn't have access to so much, and that he was more the traditions that were being narrated in Iraq he was more skeptical of, versus Malik would have. Malik loved the city of Medina and its people, and he saw the whole city in a sense as being the imam of cities, you might say. And of course, Jafar has some hadiths where it's what he's saying things about himself that sound rather shirky. And esoteric Shia will quote these hadiths quite boldly. And he had some very wise things to say, and among other imams in the Shia lineage. And then we get in the Sunni imams that are famous, we get the infamous Usul al-Fiqh that Ash-Shafi is credited with, which, from a reformist point of view, is the philosophical corruption of Islam by adopting an Usul al-Shirk, making partners of texts. And then Hanbal runs with this, and um, only found daif hadiths he didn't like when they contradicted his Baal worshipping, um, exclusivist inversion of the true message of the Quran, turning it into a literalist death cult. If I can be rather usually I try to be more charitable to my ideological opposite within the Deen, but this time I'm being a bit firmer. And people really revere these imams. There was a hadith. They'll even quote hadiths of people who weren't. They're not prophetic. Um, and like, so there was some guy who said that if you should have children, because if you might luck into having giving birth to someone like Shafi or Hanbal, and that is better than 1,000 years of worship. And yet these people, in my estimation, submitted the ummah, ultimately billions of people over the middle belt of the world, into 1,000 years of darkness. And yet even their contributions, which I'll give them credit for being pious and for reasoning somewhat consistently, even if their axiomatic logic is problematic, deeply problematic to me, that is better than the closing of the doors of ijtihad in the cementing of these empires and of this status quo of the Iqta land rent system and the military government ulema alliance, where these are ulema in name only. They're only codifying and rubber stamping the status quo, and yes, you can have all these slave women, and yes, it's halal to take this wealth as in this way, and it's halal to execute people. They're spreading corruption in the land, of course, when they speak out against this mafia system. And this is how Islam came to be a crystallization of satanic retardation and corruption and stagnancy. And in modernity, there's a lot of cope from revanchists who imagine themselves not the enslaved but the slavers. If only we could follow God's will and reinstate slavery, because getting rid of slavery or phasing it out was a corrupt, evil human invention. Because we're so evil, we decided to stop keeping people as property. And this is how they think, and it's based on an epistemology of the ulema, and the ulema have been getting it right, and so on. And thus, if you look at a Shia and they instill their imams with mystical significance, they might even use shirky language, or that is borderline shirk, if you want to be charitable, to describe them. And then the usul that they arrive at maybe is somewhat corrupted by these historical trends, like we see in Iran or with the Houthis. You can't even have a women-owned, women-only gym anymore. That's they don't, you know, they're really oppressing people in their own territory, the Houthis, and that's under Zaydi Shiism. So this is even lighter on the a priori imam concepts. But this just goes to show you how adopting this usuli modality will it invites shaitan. It turns Islam into something oppressive. It creates a tagut of military scholar alliance, and also